first?
Yeah, Lior will be speaking first and Tamar speaking second. No preference.
Thank you very much. Opening opposition.
Sorry. Speaking first is Rafael Hiorley, please.
Second, Lucy, please.
Thank you very much. Closing government.
Kat first, she please.
Louis second, Hiorday.
Thank you very much. And closing opposition.
Itai speaks first, no preference.
Irin is speaking second, no preference.
Thank you very much. Just a quick reminder, this is the round that is being streamed. Please, if you haven't done so, write in the chat whether you consent to being streamed. Cool. I think we are good to go. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Prime Minister.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. So I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Before the world realized the extent of the crime against humanity committed by the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, all the Western world keep on supporting the Khmer Rouge until 20 years later in the 90s and hid the criminals themselves. Also, the victims inside of Cambodia didn't get any compensation or recognition. This is still the case for these victims of thousands of families that their children were kidnapped in Argentina. And this is exactly what we want to solve by showing the extent of the crime against humanity committed by the junta of the military. I'm going to show you in my argument. First, only when we realize the extent of the war crime, we can gain the victims the right for retribution and compensation, and why it's the most important thing in the debate. Before I'll start that, 2 points of mechanism. So we think that the government is now going to investigate and try to find the traces of these kidnaps and to find suspicion children that are likely to be kidnapped. Once they find them, they force them to do this DNA test, and they tell only the families that they found their kidnapped children. They don't tell them their identity if they don't choose to. Meaning, the children that get this DNA test, like orphans, can choose whether to know their identity and to meet their parents, or to stay anonymous and individual. Any clarifications? Yes.
Yes. So just to make it clear, would children themselves, the ones that are being like blood drawn out of them, would they be told the results, whether they are the children of their parents?
They will be told the result only if they choose to and ask to know the result. If they ask to stay anonymous, they will stay anonymous. So why we only realize the extent of war crimes only when we get the extent of the war crime, we can get compensation and retribution for the victim. So I think there is a problem in the status quo in Argentina. We think that today people don't recognize the victims. First, we don't even know who the victims are. Many of them just tell the stories and people do not believe them and did not recognize them. Secondly, there is no investigation that can actually find these people and show the government regrets for the crime that was upon these families. Thirdly, we just think that we don't know the extent of the crime and what exactly happened to these people and to how many families it actually happened. We just know a few stories that didn't get any recognition. But I think now, first of all, we know who the victims are in the first place, who to approach. But moreover and more important, we know the extent of the crime that happened and why it was such a big crime against humanity. Why is it true? First of all, just know the numbers. I think that when we heard that there were some cases of kidnap, it doesn't sound like a crime against humanity. But if we know that it's tens of thousands of kidnaps, it sounds much higher crime against humanity and get the recognition. Secondly, just now people feel more comfortable to talk about it because they see that the government cares about it and take care about it, therefore more and more people can tell the story and testify what happened to them. We think that this is how we get the extent of the number of how many cases and how actually it happened to these peoples in the first place. Now, when we know the extent of what happened, it pressures the government to give compensation and recognition to these people. And four mechanisms for that. First of all, it's the visual thing. We think that a number symbolizes something much bigger than any few stories that you get. And every Jew around the world knows the number 6 million. It's a number we can't forget because it shows us the extent of the huge crime against humanity committed in the Holocaust. We know that 3 million people were killed in Cambodia. These numbers are the symbol that show us how big the crime was, and we remember and tell them again and again. This is exactly where we can show it in Argentina and understand how huge this crime was, and it drives our attention. Secondly, we just think that the press will start to get interested in that. When there is this commitment, people are going to talk about it, they're going to be interested about it. This is exactly where the press is going to much more investigate these cases in the first place, to talk with people who did this DNA test, to talk with the families that are found to be victims, ask them about their testimony, what happens to them, that will get much more public recognition and people are talking about it. Third of all, it gets more and more international criticism. I think this is exactly where the ICC is going to realize, wow, there was a huge crime against humanity in Argentina. We need to investigate that over other things that happen in the world. We think that this is the only way we can overcome all the reasons the government has to hide this number and hide these crimes. Things like it is expensive to investigate, it is really hard work, they are afraid of criticism and they want to glorify their history. Only when it's really meaningful and severe crime, this is exactly where it's significant enough for them to overcome these reasons and actually do something. Now, what is so important about the things that we think that are going to do? We think that, first of all, the government is likely to do some stuff about it because now they have the international criticism, because they realize the extent and they feel the guilt, and because there's a lot of public criticism in the press and in the media talking about it. Now, three things are going to happen there. First of all, we think it's much likely that they'll give compensation to the victim. It's money for the psychotherapists that need to take over their lives, for them losing their jobs because they were searching for their children instead of going to work. It's these things that are extremely important to these families to actually keep on going on and keep on with the life. Before I continue, I'll take CO.
Yeah, we think it makes sense that to some extent, some people already gave this information. We need to explain why, if you don't going to reveal the other people, you don't going to tell their names, how are you going to change anything in the world?
So we can show the statistic. We show that we found 30,000 children that are victims of this kidnap. We don't need to show their names and to harm their privacy in the way that CO probably want. We just need the numbers and to show the extent, and we don't need to hurt their privacy for that. So the second thing we get is to give rights to these groups of victims. It's things that give them free psychology therapies if they need to. Things like support groups funded by the government. It's things like giving them discounts in national security and things in government services. These are things that are crucial to recognition for these victims. Third of all, we get also the recognition, things like Memorial Day, like giving them the respect they need, how to know the suffering that they were been through. I think it's extremely important for people that other people will understand what they were going through, that will wants to help them and to talk to them about it. They will remember the crime that people did upon them. I think it's exactly what we do with Holocaust survivors when we give them this respect. We think these families also deserve this respect because the crimes committed for them. Why is these things is the most important and we should force it? We think that we really, the harm of privacy is minimal to these people, but for the victims, it's the crucial thing that suffer for many years. It's the right for recognition and compensation for the crimes they are committed, and for these reasons, I'm very happy to propose.
I'd like to thank the speaker very much for this speech, and now I'd like to call upon the first speaker for the opposition. I'm also going to switch to data, so I'll probably just be cut for 5 seconds. So.
Okay. Is it fine if I start now? Yeah. Okay. Panel, three things in this speech. First, I'll give a clarification and a comparative of what the world actually looks like in Argentina, because I think OG just had a very generic case, we'll do some reconciliation. Secondly, why we really should care about the psychological well-being of these children and why things are going to be really bad for those children who are also victims. And lastly, why even if you care about the things of reconciliation in Argentina, you should still definitely not do something that is going to be really bad for Argentinian politics. So first, what does the world actually look like? Several things. Firstly, note that the entire opposition government based their entire case on the idea that somehow in Argentina, people don't know the actual harms that happen from the regime. That is an absolute lie, right? Several reasons why that's the case. People already know there were 30,000 30,000 disappeared people. There are already like monthly vigils and like yearly memorations of the things that happened. You already have all the mothers of Plaza de Mayo going into protesting those things. We already know the extent of most crimes. Yes, it's true, we don't know the extent of all crimes, right? But we already know that they did this, given that it's something we can pass. Like we already know that there's a systematic policy from the regime. Secondly, know that there are already many reasons why many of those children would just voluntarily decide to want to know, especially those that suspect that their circumstances are shady, would probably already want to come out forward. Some of them have already come out forward and have done these things voluntarily. We think you can already do those sort of like nice stories with those children. But also know that the current government has massive incentive to show it, right? Because the government is a center-left government full of Peronistas, and they were precisely the people that were systematically prosecuted and treated as subversives by this regime, right? So there are already massive incentives for the government to expose all of these things. And also, we already know most of the things. They have not proven why these things are actually also necessary. Also know that all of their things regarding things like compensation are things we already do. Also know something incredibly important, right? Know that they're not just going to do this for the entire Argentinian population. They're going to do so for children who they already suspect are the sort of stolen babies, right? What does this mean? It means that in the status quo, we already have enough information to know that A, this happened, and this happened to X amount of children, because those are the ones that we're likely to end up doing, right? So on those levels, we already have that. Also note that again, the sort of proof you need is not proof that it just happened. You need to put individual responsibility on certain members of the military junta, right? We don't see how just knowing that it happened more would actually help you have the evidence of who actually ended up doing so. You need the evidence of who ended up doing so, and for that you need the parents. You don't need the children, right? And the parents are very willing to give evidence. We don't understand how this case works in like real life Argentina, not just on some random generic third world developing country. Secondly, why psychological well-being is actually going to be really, really important, and why they're actually going to end up being harmed. So note that several things. Firstly, know that most of these parents, like most of the parents of the stolen children, like the ones that are currently parents, the adoptive parents, don't actually know that they did, right? Because the way in which the regime in Argentina worked is like the way in which it worked, right? It took parents, like it took children out of the subversive households, and they put them in orphanages that were like systematically ideologically aligned with the state, most likely really right-wing Catholic orphanages, right? And if you put somebody there, you ensure A, that the sort of things that children are taught right now are things that are like right-wing Catholic conservative values, but secondly, that the sort of people like that will adopt from those orphanages will not be left with subversive, right? That is why, and that's like the easy thing for the Argentine regime to do, because like it was literally just like literally leaving children like burially on the church steps, right? That was the easiest thing to do, so that is what they actually ended up doing the most. So know that firstly, what it's going to mean is that for those children that are going to be forced, they're just going, okay, firstly, that's going to fundamentally shatter the idea they have of their family. These people, even if they know they're adopted, they already believe that more or less their parents try to act in a good way. They already, like, they've already come to terms with it. And so it's already a perfectly part of their identity. They're perfectly happy. They're perfectly comfortable with their lives. We don't believe you should just massively just drop them this entire bombshell. Like even if OG wants to scroll out of this debate and say, oh, we won't tell them the results. Oh, you're still telling them. There's a huge likelihood that it's actually you. That's why we're testing you in the first place. We believe that is going to be really bad for the psychological well-being of those children, given that, again, you're fundamentally destroying the very core of their identity. You're going to make it weird for them when they interact with their families and family support and stuff like that. Those actually end up being things that are quite bad. But also note that even for the children that would be suspect and maybe do want to know this truth, it's actually end up being quite bad, right? Because what was so uniquely bad about what this government did, what was so uniquely bad about what this military junta did, was that they forced children to do things against their entire will. They just took children away without any respect for the individual autonomy of anybody involved. Therefore, we tell you that for the children that already suspect that they might have been abducted, they probably really care about the personal autonomy, right? Because that's precisely the personal autonomy that was taken out by this regime. We tell you that the moment in which you like literally force them to do something rather than giving the option to do something, it's just a state forcing you to do something again that is like again to cause traumatic reactions. Also very clearly what we think should be the way you do it. We believe that if you're carrying out those investigations, you should have two steps. Firstly, if somebody wants to know if they're suspected of doing so, they can ask. Secondly, if after they ask, they told yes, then if they want to and they wish to, they can then take their DNA test. For the people that are really maladjusted and maybe really want to know, they will still know it and the rest of the house. Lastly, politics, why we think it's going to be really bad for politics. So not again direct clashing with OG. OG really wants to tell you that they really care about like telling the truth about this regime. What we tell you is quite clear, right? We already know this regime did loads of bad shit, but also we already know this regime specifically did this amount of bad stuff through abducting babies, right? So we tell you that most of the coverage in Argentina is focusing on those things when it focuses on that, right? You can already tell those really harrowing story of all those dissidents that end up having all their children taken away, and that is the main narrative that ends up winning. What happens the moment at which the government is literally forcing people to take DNA tests, right? Firstly, they haven't explained how that would happen. I mean, at worst, that would look something like literally forcing people through like violence. Secondly, being more charitable. It would probably mean people like refusing things like education or healthcare or stuff like that if they don't do it the same way you do with anti-vaccine stuff, right? How does this look like? Before continuing, I'd like a PR from CG.
But you're not taking their autonomy away. You just make them do a DNA test and then they can choose whether they want the results.
No, like literally, you're forcing them to take a DNA test, right? That is literally forcing them to do something medical that they do not want to do, right? We do still believe that that is like literally doing something as a choice. Anyways, why is this likely to be so bad, right? Because now you create this massive image that the government is trying to use these people as pawns in order to create just another political backlash. Why is this? Because literally, it's not like the government can say, we really care about these victims, we really care about the well-being of these children, and that is why we want to change it, that is why we want to prosecute those regimes, right? Because if you cared about them, then you would not be doing things like forcing them to literally do something that is against their will, right? If you want to convince them, you can convince them on our side without literally forcing them. Even if you just force 1 or 2, like 1 or 2%, which is like obviously not going to happen, having those people that are being forced creates a massive, massive bad story for the government, right? Because it's clear that now the government is not doing that out of good reasons, doing it out of just plain political partisanship. That means that all the good investigations that they want to have are overshadowed the moment at which there's a question of why is the government doing it? It's clearly not about the children. We believe we should try to make it as consensual as possible so we can focus on the actual crimes, not on any possible bad things the government is doing right now for political reasons. So ultimately, because we're the ones that better understand Argentina, we're taking this debate.
I would like to thank speaker very much for this speech, and now to call upon the second speaker for the government.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Look, the entirety of OO's case is based on the fact that the psychology of people is going to be greatly harmed, and also that their privacy is somehow greatly harmed. If I show you that not only is that not necessarily true, but also that we need to find out the extent of this so that we can satisfiably both rectify the wrongs done to people before and also prevent this kind of harm from happening in the future, we're going to win this debate. First, a few points of rebuttal to opening opposition. Look, they say that there is already some form of recognition for this stuff happening and some form of compensation. I really, I don't want to argue about facts or whatever. I do want to point out that individual families that come forward and claim that something has happened to them and their child has been taken away from them, there is no way to corroborate this and no way to necessarily believe them and have them get the recognition that they need, them have the support that they need, them necessarily getting the things that they need without having proof that this is actually a story from their family. It is highly likely that people won't want to believe every single family that comes forward because they don't rationally think that someone from their own country could have done this extent of damage to people. It's so many people they don't want to believe it's possible, and it's really easy to rationalize false claims by saying, I don't know, maybe some of these children just died and their families are coming forward because they want the compensation. We just don't think that on an individual family level, and individual families were super duper harmed in this and have the right to demand to get these things if they need them. We just don't think that is possible without corroborating their story. The alternative is just believing literally every family that comes forward and saying that is true. And we think that is just less likely, but also worse, A, because we think it is just a huge waste of resources, B, it shows the extent of the damage was larger than it was, which also is bad. And 3, we think that when people are unlikely to believe in the first place, even if the government does give out these things, it doesn't give the place of importance and the victims the real recognition, because it's really easy to say, oh, they're just one of those that we believe because we had no other choice. So we don't think that is a good alternative. But then they tell us then they tell us about the psychology of the adopted parents and their children, right? Let's talk about the children a second. A lot of them, it's true, already suspect that because they were adopted, maybe they were, that maybe they were part of these children that were kidnapped. What we are offering these children now is a chance to know that this is actually the truth for their story. Does this mean, and I know we're talking about forcing everyone here, but what I want to point out is the minute that we need the extent of this damage to give rights to the people who deserve these rights, even the children who are also victims, who will want to get to these rights as well, needs for people to know the extent of the damage done in order to get the recognition from themselves. We think that at the point that OO doesn't show us that most of the children won't want to know in the first place, and we think that a lot of them will want to know, and will want to know the extent of the damage done, and will want to know they were part of a group and will want to know the extent that their own country harmed them, that they don't actually prove that we are harming their autonomy at the end of the day. And to those that won't want to know and we're forcing them, we just think that on the whole, society is more important, and the ability to hurt the victims is more important than than just hurting their autonomy by doing a small DNA test, which is not a medical procedure. It is literally a cotton swab in your mouth, and then you can forget about it. Then we have a lot of things about politics, right? We just don't think that this is true. The most importantly, we think this will have support. We think that people will want the government to do this. We think people want to know the extent of the damage, especially the families that this may have harmed. I think people are interested in knowing this. We don't think this is actually going to look like violence. It's far more likely that it's going to look like fines for people who don't want to do this, maybe going door to door, maybe asking them to come in. I just don't think it's actually going to look like violence and literally pushing people to the ground and forcing a cotton swab into their mouth. And at the end of the day, I just don't think that this affects so many people that people are actually going to riot and cause disquiet inside the country. Let's move forward to why this is super, super important to society. Look, my partner already talked to you a lot about why the rights and recognition of these people is super important and why they were very, very harmed, very harmed in this process, because their child was literally taken away from them, and their recognition as victims and getting the kind of compensation they deserve, which is both in the form of making sure that Memorial Days get it right and how many people were hurt, that they are recognized by their peers and their family. Maybe they can get subsidized psychological care and support groups that come up when people know the extent of the damage done. This already goes a long way to help the victims that were already harmed in the past. But more than that, my partner also talks to you about worldwide recognition and a number and a name you can give to things when this happens. When you know the extent of the damage and when you know it was large enough and you know exactly how many people it was, then people can focus on that, and it brings people and it makes sure people can people can notice things both on an individual level worldwide and also larger bodies. It means that international bodies can notice this kind of thing, know that it is worth their paying attention to it and realizing to what extent it happened. It means that when they have to prioritize what kinds of things and what kinds of rules they are noticing in different countries, and they know what kind of things led to the rise of the junta and how to prevent it, that means they are focusing on it and know that it is a big thing. We think that otherwise it's really hard to do because people don't want to believe that humanity can do these things. They want to believe that maybe it was a one-time thing that happened that one time in a different place, which is why it's super important to show that it can happen in many different cultures and is recurring. So that individual people, when they are focusing on their own country, can take into account that maybe this can also happen in mine, and I should recognize the patterns that led to this happening in different countries, and I can make sure that I speak out and protest when that happens to me. Before I continue, I will take opening.
People in Argentina literally know the government killed 30,000 people, some by literally throwing them off helicopters, and they already know they systematically abducted these children. Why do you think they just won't believe it? They already know this.
Okay, I already told you why for specific families this makes a really huge difference. But also the act of doing this, the act of making sure they're taking it seriously and making sure they can right the wrongs done to every single individual family is super important, because it leads attention to it, it gains media attention, and means internationally we can notice this thing as well. And that is how we are not only compensating people for the past, but also preventing future harm by making sure that this has the awareness of people, that they are noticing it, and this has the awareness of international bodies that know where they can focus attention if they see patterns like this rising again worldwide. What do we show you at the end of the day? We show you at the end of the day that the harm to the privacy of individual people is very minimal. We think most of them are going to want to know what their identity is, and we are giving the people the opportunity to be compensated and to get the support that they need from the surroundings and from their state. But more importantly, we are drawing other people's awareness and making sure that they know that they can, to prevent and recognize these patterns from happening in the future and not allow future harm to happen to other people. When we show you both of these things, we are very proud to propose.
I would like to thank you very much for this speech. And now I would like to invite the second speaker for the opposition.
Am I audible and all good? Can someone thumb up if any? Great.
Yes, you are.
Excellent. Yeah, if I can get POIs, you can wave a piece of paper at me. Ideally, don't look at the chat really. Okay, cool. I'm going to talk about three things in this speech. First, on what the comparative actually is and how these two sides of the house differ. Second, on why it actually is quite large autonomy and privacy violation. And lastly, how they're actually harming the discourse that they want to achieve. First, let's talk about the comparative, because I think that's a bit of a confusion on the Deputy Prime Minister when they say, like all in response to us is, oh, most people will want to know anyway. It's not an invasion of autonomy because people would want anyway. Note that I think Raf is quite clear about what we stand for on our side of the house instead, right? If many individuals will be willing to submit to this on both sides of the house, we are perfectly fine with allowing individuals to do this voluntarily. We would provide them with all the same benefits opening government wants to give them. We would give them all the compensation that they want, right? We think that that because of that, many people do want to contribute to against the junta, insofar as this overwhelming narrative in the Argentinian society that like the junta is something like the government as a central government has an incentive to portray the junta in as worst possible way, which means that many people will actually come forward, they will provide a discourse, they will provide their personal stories, they will actually do it voluntarily. None of this changes on our side of the house. On their side of the house, they have to stand for going to the minority that do not want to provide that information and actively force them to do this. They give like responses as to why this is something that is necessary. They say like the families won't be believed unless you have an actual proof. The first thing to say is that like you already have quite a large idea about the extent of through which happens. Insofar as you can identify the people that are suspect, like you can also identify that the family is quite believable. But secondly, note that like you do not need a specific child to be able to to verify the claim of the family that someone has been taken away from them. Insofar as you have things like birth records still existing, the family can prove it without that DNA being necessarily taken from them. That thing makes no sense. The second thing then I want to talk about is in terms of the autonomy, right? Because like one, like given that the only response was like people will want to know, that's absolutely non-comparative. In the cases where they do not want to know, note that opening government never actually explains how exactly are they going to be forcing people to do this. They say, oh, it's not violent because you just like take something, like take it from their mouths. Like I just genuinely want opening government to explain to me how they can non-violently take something out of people's mouths without, like, against their consent, right? Like, I'm genuinely unclear how they want to do it. I think that the realistic idea of how this happens is, in the worst scenario, actual instances of physical violence happening to these people, which we think is especially abhorrent. Second, you can have things like massive privacy invasions in the attempts to get DNAs out of these people without them even knowing, like literally going into their homes, taking it away from their personal possessions, or things like just taking away people's access to like state services to force them to submit to this like in a coercive way. We think like all of this is an extra punishment on someone who has already had their autonomy compromised at the very start of their life. It is a double punishment on these victims. We think that's incredibly problematic. We think these people have a right to resist this sort of interrogation on this. Note that then, in terms of the discourse, I think the problem with opening government is that they genuinely really overestimate as to what massive difference does like the few extra people that, as they say themselves, wouldn't already submit to it voluntarily would make in changing the discourse. I think that Raf gives you several reasons as to why the discourse already exists and why they are actually not changing much. The first thing is that people already know the extent and already are incredibly against the military junta, right? Given that you have a center-left government that is specifically opposed to the past junta, is specifically trying to like differentiate itself as someone who goes against the policies, who is someone who saved the country from like the military dictatorship, is exactly the reason why the government is pushing really, really hard or providing as much of like propaganda and discourse in the media to actively differentiate themselves from their past, right? Already it's demonized. It's genuinely unclear how this is going to change anything in terms of how the Argentinian society perceives this, right? Also note that in terms of like the numbering stuff and like we need to know the exact numbers. Again, it's unclear why the marginal difference makes any sort of difference in the discourse. But secondly, note that given that they already need to know how many people are suspect in order to be able to test them, this means that like they already have a like very, very decent idea about these numbers. Also know that, like Raf explains to you, why there were so many other really, really bad things that the junta did in terms of killing people by literally like throwing them out of helicopters. So like if you need like even extra hatred against the junta, it's unclear why that's even needed to such a large extent. You already have it from all the other mechanisms, right? Also just like know that in terms of like them getting the evidence, like even if you do that DNA test, you maybe prove that someone has been adopted, but now they would also have to do the like extra proof that it was the military abduction or it was the specific adoption needs. What this means is that you already have that evidence on our side of the house as well. So it's generally unclear what they are actually changing on their side of the house for the better. Like before I explain it, why they make it worse, I would like to take closing.
Don't you think that the parents who forcibly had their child taken away also have a right to maybe know?
Right, okay, so the parents whose child was taken away already know that that happened. If the child is, like, presumably, if the child is in a family where they do not explicitly want to know where they like where the DNA what DNA they came from, they don't want to see like the original family. Presumably, if you are forced to like if they will be forced to reunite with that family, they wouldn't be having any sort of like emotional connection, any sort of like happiness would come for the original family. It would probably be like incredibly bad for them in terms of their well-being. We think like for the families who want to know, like who want to like reunite with their child, that's something that we can do voluntarily. Again, it's unclear why the non-voluntary enforcement will make any of this work. Like again, the families know that they are victims, like they literally had their child abducted, like it's not like they don't know. And also I've already explained why they can prove it. In fact, this Raf tells you this harms the ability of government to get even the stories that we would currently now get voluntarily, right? Because if the government is perceived as someone who's actively violating individuals' autonomy and actively is willing to go violent to get something, actively is showing themselves as someone who goes against the people and against these victims and respecting the basic needs they have for autonomy, because it's probably something they care about, given that they are victims of something like this, you have more antagonism against the government on the part of other people who perceive to be victims, less likely to cooperate with the government, less likely to come forward, less likely to give the actual really important and interesting flowery stories that these guys need to make the discourse happen. They are not changing anything, they're actively making it worse. Please oppose.
I would like to thank the speaker very much for the speech. And now I'd like to invite the third speaker for the government.
Can I quickly check that I'm audible?
Yes, you are.
Thank you. Okay, I'll get a timer. 3, 2, 1. What we're going to do in CG is incredibly simple. We're going to prove to you, 1, why you need specifically to force children or to force these suspected lost children to undergo this. Secondly, we're going to outline to you the exclusive benefits that parents can only get from specifically knowing whether their child is still alive and whether their child actually managed to make it through the years where they didn't know them, where a government that explicitly abducted that child had them in their power. Before that, I'll have one note on the mechanistic question that comes out of DLO. I think it's probably something where you can just put a fine on someone if they don't agree to it. Also something that you can do with doctors and annual checkup, but to the degree that I think there is coercion involved, we're willing to cop it on proposition. We're going to do an explicit principled weighing, but also a practical weighing, I think, later in order to prove why that is fine. Why do you need to force? Because note that opening government does nothing on this whatsoever. 1, because you need all of the data in order to create certainty for parents as to what happened to their child. At the point where you do not have a full pool of suspected stolen children in this, when parents do not hear anything, they cannot draw from conclusions on this. I think that means that they remain in uncertainty and that they remain in fear. They cannot adequately move on from that. I think that's incredibly destructive. That explains why we think that it is fine to some extent to force people who do not wish to consent into this procedure to do so. Why do we think that's actually a very significant number of people? And why do we think specifically the children involved also benefit? Because we think it's an incredible burden of choice to place on someone who was adopted by a different family to have to explicitly seek out that information. Why is that? I think opening opposition says, oh, no. Lots of people come forward. This is just about forcing a tiny minority. This is incorrect for 3 reasons. 1, I think children feel guilt about seeking out this information because it implies they do not trust their parents. Oftentimes, they will indeed love the parents who adopted them. They will care for them. They will care for their opinion. Note that many people place a significant amount of moral weight on the biological ties between parent and child, at which point questioning whether that is true often is seen as questioning the truth and foundation of the very relationship which you have, which as an active act that you are choosing to do is something that is incredibly deterring for those people. Secondly, people prefer the status quo because they think it is less upsetting. Even if you have questions, and I think a lot of people do question this about themselves, don't necessarily want to change things because they've learned to live with the question. They're not sure whether they'll necessarily be able to live as easily with having an answer. Thirdly, I think this means that at the point of being asked by your parents, oh, did you go get a DNA test? Either you have to lie or you have to tell them. I think both of those are things that are incredibly scary and deterring to these children, which is why they do not do it. I think that applies even for children who would benefit significantly from knowing it. But secondly, I think it doesn't just mean that many won't. I think it also means that those who are curious, who are considering whether maybe they want access to this information, have their lives significantly eased by the fact it is no longer on them to have to make the choice to betray their parents or not. I think this is important because I do not think you should be placing this burden on people to find out whether they were victims of a horrendous crime. I do not think you should have to be willing to betray the people who have brought you up in order to understand something very fundamental about your identity. That is something which you resolve. Why is there a significant benefit for the children as well? At the point where the information exists, there is a significantly lower burden to keep the envelope closed if you are curious. I think that means that because there's been an affirmation of your suspicion. You didn't create it yourself. Someone externally said hello. There's information you may want to know. That is something that is significantly less a choice of you against your parents because it is externally created. But secondly, I think it is a smaller action to look at information that has been sent to you versus to explicitly go out and seek it. That means that this is something which helps those children, but also this is necessary in order to get the significant number of opt-in that I think we need in order for this policy to be beneficial. What are the benefits of this policy? I think in terms of exclusively helping parents, there's 2 main things. 1, on principle. I think it is the role of the state insofar as it lives in the continued state borders, oftentimes continued administration, because Argentina did not have stringent lustration after the military junta. You have a continued power, but crucially, additionally, even if you buy none of this, the Argentinian state is the only one who can provide this comfort and safety to parents. I think it has a duty to alleviate the harms through this violated party who lost their children, whose children were taken away by its predecessor power. I think an analogy to how other successor regimes have a duty to some extent compensate victims, even if they are not themselves the regime that perpetuated the harm. But I think secondly and practically, in terms of the psychology of these parents, OG says you have post-hoc compensation. I think it's unclear why that materializes because they don't go to tipping point. I think it's unclear why it's exclusive because you clearly already lost your child. You can make a claim from that. It's unclear why it's impactful. What is impactful? Because note that uncertainty, even in old age, about what happened to your child is still a harm. Because you cannot forget, because you keep thinking, what is the truth? What actually happened? Because it is something that keeps you up because you never got a resolution, you never got closure. Because you will keep projecting your worst fears in your nightmares. Because note that you fear the people who took your child away. You think they are evil. You think they could have hurt them. I think this is something that you want to have an answer to. You want to know that maybe, no, my child is still alive. Even if they're not in contact with me, maybe they are happy. I think that's incredibly important to people. But secondly, in terms of legacy, I think in your old age, because note the parents of these children are oftentimes quite old now, you want to know that there is something of you that lives on. I think this is a human urge. This is why we build great cathedrals that will live on, like that maybe we will never get to see finished ourselves, but that will project that we existed because we want to have had meaning in the world. And I think oftentimes these parents will not have had much of an opportunity to create that otherwise, because the psychological impact of losing their child will have massively destroyed their ability to do other things in terms of just like career or building other things. But note it also will likely have limited their ability to have other children, because in an environment of uncertainty where you feel like if you have another child, you're replacing the one that was taken from you, you will not have had another child very often. I think that means you had no other opportunity to create legacy. Let's do weighing on coercion. Note that inaction by the state of Argentina in this is also coercive, because given that they are the only one who can provide this certainty and resolution to parents, not doing so forces them to stay and keep living in that state of uncertainty. I think that is fucking torturous. One, why is it worse than with children? One, I think the time that these parents live in uncertainty is longer than the time it takes to do a DNA test. I think the intensity of being tortured by that every day is greater. I think the unusualness is also greater. Lots of people have medical procedures like vaccines forced upon them, as opening opposition point out. People do not have to live in this uncertainty, and they fucking shouldn't have to propose.
I'd like to thank very much speaker for this speech, and now I'd like to call upon the third speaker for the opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Just a second, sorry. Okay, so I'm going to begin in 3, 2, 1. Two main points in my speech. First of all, why we think that in most cases, people already gave the information. And that's why the cases in which people refuse to have very good reason. Second argument, I'm going to explain what is this good reasons, why we think that this is very, very painful for them and therefore justified. Before justified for them to refuse it. Before that, two points of rebuttal. First of all, we think that all offside governments so far are in the same problem. I already proposed in the POI. You need to explain to us how you can still achieve your goals with anonymity. Okay, specifically, we think open government. We think it's a little bit funny that that they will never post who are the names of the people and just say, oh, we checked internally, the number is now 10 times bigger. We think that people need more than that. They need to check the data. When you post something like that, you say the name, you say what happened, you say you're able to give the opportunity to interview them and so on. Especially if you claim that people try to deny it. Now that you don't post anything, it's very likely that people who will try to claim the contrary, that the number is much smaller, will try to explain why it's like it's not, they agree that it's not everybody agreeing to it. They will try to say, oh, you don't show the number, you don't show the actual people, you don't see it's convincing, and they won't achieve none of the goals. Second answer to closing government. So they say, look, we want to prioritize the parents. 2 points to that. First of all, it's a little bit funny way of prioritizing, but notice we're talking about something that happened in 1980s. It means the parents are they're like, let's say they were like the age of 30 when it happened. Currently, the parents are the age of like 70, 80. Why is that important? First of all, we think it's more likely that they already overcame it. They're already after it. It's like, okay, they understood. Okay, we probably won't know the answer. We're like going to sadly be over with life in like 5-10 years and so on. Secondly, just like also sad, but less of them are alive by now comparing to the huge amount of orphans. And we need to understand, and something I'll explain more, how do you know that each one you're going to turn to is actually a person that was kidnapped and not just like a random orphan that you think he's part of the thing? We think you have like terrible amount of mistakes. And also, okay, so let's go to my positive. So first of all, why we think that most of the people already give this information? First of all, we think that people just like really want to do it themselves. We think in most cases that the people who are like common people are very curious about the history. They want to know what happened to my history, what happened to my parents, where do I came from, what is the origin of my history. People do like a big groundwork to understand where are their parents, grandparents, what happened to them. These people are probably orphans by now. They have huge amount of information. Most of them going to meet their parents. We think it's very likely that they will do it by far. Secondly, we think it's a very exciting story. People want to be, oh wait, am I a big part of the Argentinian history? Am I this big story that everybody been taught in school? I was part of it. It's a huge incentive for people to understand it because like whether their life is like much more exciting than they knew, and whether they've been lied to by their parents and so on. Thirdly, we think that, and the comparative in this debate is that you come and like post in the public and say, please give this information, or you you turn them individually. Why we think this is important? Because they say a little bit, like Colosi government is a little bit like naive. They say like, oh, they just don't want to hurt their parents. We think it's very likely that if you go and post it all over the news, like have like politicians say it's very important. You have like people who are famous says like it's something that we want to get, people are going to say to the parents, look, I know I'm going to open it because like it's very important. People are following norms and what everybody believes. So, and especially specifically if you can come and try to convince them and tell them, look, what exactly do you refuse to? I'm going to ensure your anonymity and everything as they say. We think it's very likely that most of the people are going to do it. Why is that important? Because A, it proves to you that most of the damages that exist in government side is very, very small. We think that Opposition did it a little bit, but they didn't give to all this analysis that I did. But secondly, it explained why the people who refuse have like a very good reason to refuse so far, and that's why the damage to them is very, very big. So now before I go into get of why the damage to them is very, very big, I'll take closing, please. If closing agree with me, then opening.
Yeah, children don't voluntarily take a DNA test when they don't even know they're suspect, and we push the government to investigate.
Thank you. They are not children. They are 40 years old. They are grown up, want to understand their history. We need to understand the actual context in this debate. The debate is happening now. Okay. Why we think that people are going to, people are very likely to do it? We need to understand what does it mean to have like the people who refuse. Some people refuse, you know, some people say, even when the actual parent's biological father say, I want to meet you, or like the adoption agency come and tells them, look, you have a chance to meet the parents. They say like, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to do it. Why they do it? Like open opposition is like a little bit naive. They don't explain. They just say, look, someone doesn't want and you force them. But why that they don't want? We think it's important to understand it. Two main reasons. First of all, some of them have very difficult questions that they didn't dealt with them fully. So like it's sad. They didn't have like, I don't know, a good therapist or somebody to help them, but very difficult question that didn't answer to them. It's a very sad question. Like why my original parents didn't want me, how my life would have been looked differently. Is the reason that my real parents didn't love me is because I'm adopted? It's a very difficult question that people, like this specific group of people avoided it. They didn't want to deal with it. It's a very difficult question that causes them like a sort of anxiety and pain. Secondly, some of these people have deep memories that are like very bad. We think that lots of people who went to adoptions in 1980s Argentina, who were like going between foster homes and so on, just had painful childhood memories. Secondly, we think that some of them that were kidnapped by the junta had like very terrible experience with this if they were like grown up to some extent. We think that means that they just want to, that's like a traumatic history in the memories, they don't want to do it. Why is that important? Because this is the burden that's missing from an open opposition. Why at the moment that it's, you just, even let's take the best side of closing government, okay? Like I'm going and I'm like somehow kidnapping your speech and I'm doing it. Why we think that still you will inflict all these damages? First of all, at the moment that I come and I try to do it forcibly, I need to remember all these things. You force me to go into all these memories. You force me to go into all these questions I forgot. This specific moment is a terrible moment that you inflict on them. Secondly, we think that it's not likely that you're just going to go jump on someone on the street, take the spirit and run away, okay? It's likely that you're going to convince them, to engage with them forcefully, say, look, we're going to enact like some sort of sanction on you. We think all this thing is like 2 weeks that are terrible and intense, that you need to go through all this effort and all this pain. Why is that mostly important? We think there's huge chance that you will mistakenly, like not only we talk about the people who already refuse, we think that in this group of people who already refuse, there are people who just like been adopted. Oh, okay. Another reason that why you will not want trust them, you might afraid that the information will be available even though they claim it's anonymous. You might just like not trust the government. We think that secondly, you might afraid that after a big backlash of people say, hey, give us the people, we want to interview them and stuff like that, people will reveal the information. And thirdly, you don't want that the parents will somehow try to meet you and get to you and talk to you. These are things that are normal fears that you might have, and it's legitimate. And we think the fact that they can't know by fact who are the people, and they're probably going to talk to each infant that they'll see, each like a person who is adopted that they see, we think be lots of mistakes. We call you to refuse the motion.
I would like to thank speaker very much for speech. And now I'd like to call upon the last speaker for the government.
Everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
3, 2, 1. Opening government is out, not only because they don't explain why more attention is needed, most of all because they don't explain why you need force. God does explain this. CO still finds this unclear, so I will repeat it. Firstly, if you are a parent, you have a right to know. If your biological child doesn't do this, then you will never know if this person is still alive. If you don't have a complete database, then you also don't know if you don't get a result, because you don't know whether your child has consented to doing this or not. Therefore, you need force for the parents. But secondly, to lift the burden on the children to choose between their parents. The reason why it's not enough for CO to explain that you can just have campaigns is because you ask people to choose between their adoptive parents, where they have like a very much an important relationship with, and their biological parents. And even if that's not really the choice, it feels like the choice for a lot of people. It feels like you're doing that. And you're like, if you're on the fence, you're doing that not necessarily because you don't want to know, but because you feel like you are making the choice. The choice is actively harmful. So the force might actually be a good thing for you. But secondly, I think the problem is that you also might be accusing your adoptive parents of cooperating with this junta regime, because this person did adopt a child which was kidnapped. Therefore, they clearly benefited from that junta regime. You know that some parents will have known that these were children who are kidnapped. So it feels like you're accusing your adoptive parents. That, even if that is not true at all, that is still something that is going to be incredibly scary for people to do. We would rather have them not have a choice, because then they're not accusing them. They can like not only say that to other people, but also in their mind, they're saying, I was forced, I couldn't do anything about this. That's actually a much better scenario. Firstly, some response to OO that should fit in, and then a trade-off in autonomy and harms between the rights of parents and children. Firstly, opening opposition said this is bad for Argentinian politics because there's no good reason for it, and that means people are going to hate the government. Firstly, no impact of being angry against the government. I don't know whether that is important. Secondly, CAT supplied this good reason, so people will agree with that and be fine. Thirdly, parents are now angry at the government for not doing this. The government is the only one who can do this. The government is the only one that can alleviate their suffering. They're not doing this. This point is irrelevant. Secondly, on the forcing means punishing. Firstly, this is a small amount because of CAT's analysis that most people would want to do this, but feel pressure to not do this because they don't want to accuse their parents of anything, or want to say their parents are bad. So this is a small amount of people who we're actually having to force. Secondly, we actually believe this is justified. If you only need to give some saliva, and this creates all the benefits that CAT outlines to the parents, and oh, by the way, never gets a response, then I think you are actually a bad person, and we're fine with forcing you. But thirdly, we can do this through doctors. We don't have to, like, in like 99.99% of the case, we don't have to like strap you down and put a stick in your mouth. Most cases, we can just do this, right? So like, if you want to give the win to OL for this, like, I really can't do anything about that. But I think that is just like on the trade-off here, like the impacts that we're talking about here, that just seems very small to me. Let's talk about autonomy. Firstly, we would like to compare this with vaccination. So we are allowed to force you to do a vaccination and deny you all sorts of government benefits if you don't do that, because we protect third parties. We think the exact same is happening here. Vaccinations are much more invasive than this, so we think this is much more justified. Opening opposition says that autonomy is incredibly important for these people because their autonomy has been taken away. And CO adds that these people were also like harmed, they might have trauma, and you don't want to do that to these people. We say that this is exactly obviously the same for these parents, because these parents also like had their child removed from them. They had no autonomy in that. They were like one of the most harmed by this government. I actually think it's worse for parents in this instance, because usually the children were orphans and just don't remember, and that's like quite easy to say, but they usually don't remember. Well, the parents always remember, right? So that's the first way to trade that off, should go to the parents. Secondly, a lot of children are not free now, so they don't have autonomy now because they feel pressured. We give them autonomy by enforcing this policy, as I already explained. Thirdly, the extent of the autonomy taken away. Only a stick of saliva in your mouth is not as important as not knowing where your child is. That is the more important autonomy, as I will go into now. But firstly, OO.
So parents also don't consent to this policy. Why is it okay to force parents to revisit bad memories they might have moved on in the past 50 years? They might be actually incredibly hurt to know their child might be alive, but doesn't want to know them at all. Why don't you just stay on the caution and choice?
The parents don't have to give their DNA. The parents don't have to meet their children. They can do, like, they can choose to want that, and the child can choose to want that, and then surely we can connect them. But the parents don't have to do anything on this motion, so that obviously doesn't stand. Like, we POI'd you on this, and you didn't respond, and that's a shame, because that could have helped you in this round. So Kat already explained why it's incredibly important to know whether your child is alive, and that only can happen under our side of the house, because a legacy is important to people, because you think about this for your entire life. CO's response that the parents are dead or already forgot is simply not enough. Firstly, most people live 40 years after getting a child. Most parents will still be alive. Secondly, you have 2 parents per child, so you have more parents than children. Thirdly, this is the most horrible thing that's ever happened to these people. People who lose a child in their life usually lit candles on the day every single year. This is something that you think about, maybe not every day, but it's on your mind constantly. This is one of the major themes within your life. This is one of the, the harm done to these parents is unimaginable. We should help them. Let's trade that off then against the right of the child. Okay, I do grant sometimes it is bad for the child. Sometimes you have to revisit memories which are bad. That is the worst case scenario that opposition can claim. And because of Kat's analysis, this is not the majority at all. But even if that is true, we still think that the major theme within the lives of their parents is more important than, because you can also choose to not think about it. You can choose to try to not think about that much. Because of all these reasons, we think the trade-off should go to the parents, and therefore propose.
I would like to thank speaker very much for this speech. And now I'd like to call upon the last speaker for the opposition.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Great. Starting 3, 2, 1. Panel, 2 important clashes in this debate. First of all, where we get more conciliation for the parents, and secondly, the mental harm to the child. Let's go directly into the first clash, and let's start with CG. Note that they barely responded to their argument, and I'm going to rebuild the little damage they did later. But let's see what their actual bottom lines are. A, they claim that currently the parents have uncertainty, and we need to resolve it. Note that on both sides of the house, the parents has lots of uncertainty. They only know whether the child, for certain now that their child was kidnapped by that regime. Note, they still don't know whether he lived a good life or lived a living hell in the orphanage. We really don't know why they need to assume that he didn't have many struggles. We really don't know on the comparative why they assume he is dead, given that there is historical evidence to suggest that he might have been kidnapped. And we really don't know why this significant delta, this slight delta in the information they have is so significant. Note that once they have so much uncertainty, if they are very pessimistic, we think it's really bad for them to know that he was kidnapped by an opposing military regime. If they are optimistic, we really don't and it can have so much hell, go through so much hell in those years. If they are optimistic, then they can probably don't assume the worst, that he is dead. Now, secondly, I want to go into the analysis on why the parents the children are not going to agree. 3 things I want to say. The first point that you're currently confronting with your biological parent. In the majority of the cases, those children know that they are adopted in the first place, know they have been through an orphanage, know they might not be similar to their actual parents because they are adopted, know that in many cases they were not adopted when they are 1 or much later in life, or there are other siblings or other people around them who might give them this information. Therefore, we really don't think that this is so specific to the motion in minority of the cases. Secondly, they tell us that and the second harm they tell us about the parents, I'm sorry a bit about the math, is now that we know that my parents supported the regime and actually helped them in this. Note, those parents who are specifically selected because they were for the regime, supported the current regime, and would educate their child to support it. No, the child is well aware that the parents were on the side of the regime and help them. The case that the parent could claim that he didn't have any other choice works in both sides of the house. We really don't see why there is much delta here. So secondly, it tells that you need to make an active choice. And I'm going to engage a bit with this later on as substantive. Note that also opening the envelope in itself is an active choice. Also going through this process does involve so many other active choices. I really don't know why this specific one is so much tougher. And fairly, and most importantly, OG has already considered that the majority of children will actually take the test, therefore, and will go through with it. Therefore, the entire analysis from CG is simply a knife at their best. Let's move on. Now that let's move a bit onto what we have from OG, and I want to be very quick at it. Note at the point that A, the majority of children already have the test. We have a very, very good approximation of how many people we have and the extent of the damage being done, even if we don't have other historical facts. B, they claim that we need to have exact numbers. I really don't know why this is true as opposed to the horror story, and why like only 6 million, I put the actual painful story that the child went through is so significant in the eye of the media. Thirdly, we do have numbers. Not if we have some imprecision, meaning instead of 30,000, we claim that it's approximately 25,000 to 35,000. I don't know why it is less persuasive. The test that we need larger number. I don't know why the approximation is necessarily going to be lower. And most importantly, we already analyzed why it is equally is credible. In my member's speech, given that we don't publish the actual names of the people, we don't have any better information than to just trust the government in the first place. We really don't think they have a huge data here. They tell us that people are not going to believe the victim, therefore it's going to get, and they are going to get a lot of help. They already considered that the victims who do not have actual proof on both sides of the house are the minority. Secondly, I really don't know how many people will actually challenge a parent who has lost their child. And I want to remind everyone, this motion assumes that you have historical and some good reason to suspect that this child has been adopted. I really don't know why that many people are going to suspect that those most vulnerable and like tragic people are lying, as opposed to actually try to sympathize with them, given that they've been even remotely related to this. They are not even remotely related to the situation. And B, they already have like quite a bit of evidence to call it. I really don't know. I understand the delta here. Also, in the media part, I've already engaged. Now, let's move on to the second clash, to harm the child. No, we think that we barely get any response from CO. No, what we tell you is that the adoption, the process in itself, does require you to give quite a bit of fat to to the matter. Note that adoption in itself is a very, very painful process for many people. For years, I wonder why didn't my parents have it? What happened? Why didn't they defend me? How? And B, secondly, the life in the orphanage itself is often extremely painful. Oftentimes do not get the attention I need. Oftentimes I feel left alone, or I feel that and feel I really don't know if I can connect to my parents because I don't know why they picked me up, because they're ulterior motives on this side of the house. We claim that some people are curious and do want the closure, and they will probably do it on both sides of the house. We think that many people do not care about this issue and don't have the psychological harm. Those are also going to probably take the test on both sides of the house. Those who do not are one who actively try to shy away from this, from those damage. Before I continue, I'll take POI closing.
As a child, you still have a lot of choices left. The only choice that you don't have is to give you up your DNA. It's so much worse for the children compared to the parents.
Okay, but I've shown that the harm to the parent is so minimal. I really don't understand why you have a significant delta of it. And B, we claim that the harm is not just a loss of your autonomy, and therefore this POI does not engage. Okay, we think that at the point that you need actually to, for the entire process, be reminded of your entire childhood and the circumstances regarding your adoption. Why? Because A, you already, your entire analysis that the testing itself is like challenging your original parent. Secondly, the entire basis to the reason why you are doing this test and the entire process, every time you are at the office, or the doctor office, you're probably going to think of the reasons you are there. And once you're waiting for the result in the mail, you're probably thinking on what happened there. It's going to remind you of all those painful times you have been through. And this is very important. Even if you've been to painful times and you have not gotten closure, it has been 40 years ago. Many people have managed to move on and simply do not actively think about it as much. They have many other things to focus on their life, but you are going to have to make them spend so much time, so much effort, and so, like fill out all the forms, go to the doctor appointment, actually actively think about their own constitution and remind them that they are highly suspect of being not a biological child. Then they are going to have to to deal with all the trauma and damage which was dealt to them in this process. Panel, please oppose.
I would like to thank Speaker very much for this speech and everyone for this debate. So I'd like to invite now speakers to leave the calls.